And that's why I say a Grateful Dead concert is like life. I mean, not every day is great. Not every day's probably got a little bit of everything, right? And if you hang in there till the end, you might find a great Scarlet Fire. You know?
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, you can find every episode there, along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. One of those new releases is All the Years Combined, the Grateful Dead in 50 Shows. We have Ray Robertson on the show. He is the author of the book. Ray listened to and wrote about 50 of Grateful Dead's most important and memorable concerts in order to better understand who the Grateful Dead were, what they became, and what they meant, and what they continue to mean. A playlist of live Dead through the years on the show notes page. Ray, welcome to the podcast, man. Great to meet you. When did you come up with this idea to chronicle 50 shows?
Yeah, ideas sound a little bit above my workstation. This is my 15th book, and I'm pretty lazy. I think basically, though, when I kind of get obsessed with something, I have to sort of get it out. You know, I'm not a musician, but I have musician friends, and sometimes they'll tell me, well, you know, how did you write that slice? I had to formalize it, structuralize it, and get it out of my life and onto it. And so I had written a novel previous to this one called The Stakes Large and Small, which has a guy in it who listens to a lot of Dead and sort of at an interesting point in his life. Anyway, at that point, I finished the novel, and the pandemic happened. So every night I got a little studio back where I write. So every night, my wife is a painter. She paints at night. So I had my evenings free. So every night I would go listen to the Dead and make notes. And it kind of just felt like a narrative started to evolve. It wasn't like, because this show isn't the 50 greatest hits of the Dead. You know, that would be anybody's opinion. But what I found was, because I really wanted to share how the music had impacted me and how the Dead as role models, if you will, as ambassadors of integrity and experimentation and coexisting kind of with the mainstream, all that stuff's very interesting to me. But when I started to think about the shows, I realized that there was another narrative, and it was sort of, which is always a good sign, you know, when you're writing a book, if you know what you're going to do before you do it, it's a really interesting book. You kind of have to discover things. And I discovered the book was kind of also about success, you know, material success, commercial success, financial success, and how that isn't always the most successful way to live. And it's that tension between, because you want more readers, you want more listeners, you want more fans. But obviously with the Dead, it became something else where you're playing football stadiums and you're losing something that was before. So I just found the whole thing, I think initially it was just a very, very proselytizing. You have to know about Jerry Garcia's guitar or you will die. You have to know about this. I will bring that. But then something else evolved, and it was a story. And that's why there's 50 shows, but they're all part of, I think, this arc that kind of goes over, you know.
Well, arc is a good word because it's parallel to the arc of our lives. Like you reach, you're learning, you're getting better, and then you reach that peak, and then you do reach those years where you start to plateau, and then maybe there's a decline.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a million biographies in my life. None of them end real well, you know, because they cared the person dies, the people around them die. But that's not how we judge a life, though. It's not like, they got old and died. Well, we all do if we're lucky. It's the same thing with musical bands. I think what's interesting with the Dead, though, is that simultaneous with their sort of leveling off as for me, as a musical experience, that was their highest, greatest peak of commercial success. So you've kind of got, well, you know, Bruce Hornsby, who played with them a little bit near the end, and I always loved his contributions. And they asked him why he you know, opted out, and he said, well, aside from my solo career and I had kids and stuff, it was also that, you know, we'd be playing and everybody would know it was a crappy gig, and the audience would be going bananas, you know, because it had transcended beyond a musical thing. It had become a social, communal, wonderful stuff. You know, I have friends who went to shows in the 80s and 90s and it changed their lives. Not necessarily the music, but more the community and all of that stuff. So I think that's very interesting too, you know, and also there's almost a resentment, at least on Garcia's part, toward their success, you know. I don't think anyone expected Touch of Grey to be a top 10 hit, and it kind of blew the ecosystem open. Previous to that, you kind of found out about bands like the Dead by somebody saying to you, hey, you should check this out. You didn't hear them on the radio very much. The ecosystem, I think, was very livable and sustainable. But when you have MTV saying, "Hey, it's the greatest party in the world. There's lots of free love and drugs. Come on down." And it changes a bit, and I think that was really interesting to me too. Not to criticize, but just sort of understand how it's interesting that the more successful you are, sometimes financially or career wise, perhaps it has an effect on the art that's not exactly the same. And I do believe that the Dead at their peak were artists. I think they were right there doing something that no one else was doing. They weren't just another rock band in 1974 doing what the Stones did or the Who did. Something entirely different. Not necessarily better, not everybody's cup of tea, but very, very unique and different.
We're similar. I think what we have in common after reading the book is you said you became a fan in your mid to late 40s.
Yeah.
Now, for me, it was mid 90s. And at that time, I would have been in my 20s. But still, it was actually just before Jerry passed away when I finally decided, because my older brother kept saying, you got to go to a show, to a show.
See,
so I
that.
remember saying, yeah, okay, well, we'll do it when they come around again. And Jerry passed away.
Right.
So, but it's interesting because there are fans that come along throughout the eras of the Dead. There are people that were there from day one. There are people there that got on in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. There are kids today now who are discovering them, which I find really interesting.
And that's kind of what the book's about. The book's not about, my favorite concerts on a day. It's somebody listening to this stuff with headphones on beyond, because there will come a point in 25 years and anybody who saw the Dead isn't around anymore. I mean, I have friends who actually saw them in 73, 74. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But they're 65 years old. They're not going to be around for. So what we're going to be left with is the same thing when we're left with a writer who dies. We're left with his or her books. We're just with the music. We don't need Billie Holiday to be here to listen to Billie Holiday, and we can talk about it. And I think that's kind of where they're transitioning to in terms of the time space continuum. I think we're getting to the point where there's just really the music left.
A big part of it is the bootlegs, though. That's a huge. That's the only way. The way I was introduced to them was by my brother giving me the May of '77 New Haven show. Not here's in the dark. You got to check out Touch of Grey. And the band didn't think about that at the time. I think the story was that it just became so overwhelming for them to try to stop it that they just said, go ahead and do it.
And going back even further than that, when Owsley decides to record their shows for his own, it wasn't because, one day we'll be old men who will need a pension. They were young men. And when the gig's done, what do? You don't go party. You go back to the room and listen to the show, because you're young and full of piss and vinegar. And they did that. He also wanted to know how his recordings sounded or whatever. But there did come a point where they would just record them and store them away in the famous Grateful Dead vaults, And to me, that's very exciting because not everything's in there, stuff happens. But you really can't hear a band starting from 66, let's say, the first show in the book, when they were kind of an R&B, Stonesy cover, mostly a cover band, really. Some crappy originals, and Pigpen was the main guy. And you can hear, like, Garcia hadn't been playing electric guitar for that long. I mean, he picked one up, but he was a banjo player, which makes him such an interesting electric guitar player because he's not strumming, he's picking. It's more like a Grant Green as a jazz player. And you have Lesh, who never played the bass guitar at all. Garcia says, well, I don't play the guitar. It doesn't matter. You understand music. You're one of us. And I think that's incredibly antithetical to our age where everything's market driven and make sure it's like, no, this feels right. We'll figure the little things out, like how to play the instrument, which is one of the reasons that Lesh is just so phenomenally fascinating to listen to because he has no desire to hold down the bottom. I play it for friends who are like, old punk friends, like, this is a shitty rock and roll band. They're not a rock and roll band. When they do play rock and roll, it's okay, but there's no bottom to it because Lesh is like, fuck you guys. I'm going to be up here and here and here and here. He's just fascinating. Initially, of course, it was Garcia. I have the headphones on. You've noticed Lesh and Weir and all these interests. They're more like a big band in the sense they all use different instruments,
And that's a perfect transition to what I was about to say, because my dad and my mom, I played the Grateful Dead for both of them. My dad and mom both born in 1939, and my dad was a big band fan. He was into all the jazz stuff, Miles Davis. So when I finally just said, hey, give this a listen, he was blown away by it. Wow. And here's somebody who was born in 1939 because he was hearing the jazz aspect of it. He was hearing the big band thing. He was hearing the experiment. And I remember he was blown away. I said, no show is the same. Sometimes even if they play the same song back-to-back nights, it's played differently. He goes, really? He was, well, it's really music for all ages.
It really is, and all tastes. I mean, when I first got into the Dead, I mean, I had heard of them. You read the last essay in the book, which isn't about the shows; it's how I became a Deadhead. So they had been there my whole, because I was a country rock guy. You know, I've written a book on Graham Parsons and stuff. So I was country rock, old country. So of course I knew about Working Man's Dead and American Beauty. They'd been there my whole life. But I think for me, it took me a while to get your dad's ears, to become that guy who could hear the parts. Because really, the best of their music, you can tell they're listening to each other, which is not something you get later on, I think.
Right.
And it's, you know, it's a consequence of playing for 65,000 people, getting tired of playing with the same people for 30 years. And tonight's this night. But early on, and you can't have that without that symbiosis. And that is jazz. You know, there are so many shows that in the book where there's just like one little thing. Like there's a great show from 73 where they're doing a typical another one, which is by that era is about 20, 25, sometimes 30 minutes. And they're about 7 minutes in. It's all kind of bubbling, kind of spooky, spacey. And then Garcia says in his mind, no, I'm going to play Eyes of the World. Real samba, real like. He didn't feel like going down that road.
Right.
I found that incredibly antithetical to the rock star kind of, we're going to play our songs, you know. It's like, no, I don't feel like playing that. And to me, that's not just a musical inspiration. That's sort of inspiration in terms of living life. Like, I think we can learn a lot from that kind of open. I make a case in the book that especially Garcia were never hippies; they were beatniks. And it's the idea is that no, you don't perform for people. You and some people get together and you have a party, more or less. And if you like what we're doing musically, groove. And if you don't, well, go see someone else next week or whatever, right?
So I'm curious now, because the book covers the years 1966 to 1995, over 2,300 shows total while Jerry was alive. So what was the process that you went through when you chose just these 50 specific shows?
Yeah. Well, there are some that you had to hit, like the one that we mentioned off air, or maybe we're on here. You talk about the Cornell show from '77. You got to have that show. So there were shows like that, but for me, it wasn't just like 50. Like, it isn't the 50 greatest hits. It's sort of like that show from '78 illustrates how, this or that. Like '78, some of my favorite Dead is from '78, but there are some rough patches. There's some interband stuff. There's some pharmaceutical stuff. There's the fact that it's guys are in their early 30s now and things are changing. But then there'll be these moments that are transcendent, a piece of the show. So sometimes I would include shows for that. One thing that can be said about the book is there's a lot of music post 80 in the book. And, I've taken some flack for that. But for me, the way that I tell the story, my version of the story of the Dead is that the richest, most interesting stuff was earlier musically. Now, 80 to 95, that's the mega years. And there's definitely some good stuff in there. And I, point out some of the shows. But for me, I definitely have a bias toward, like, my favorite period is like 71 to 74, when Keith and Donna Gaju joined the band. And it gets jazzier. It gets more. I think Keith facilitated that. Having a piano player in the band as opposed to an organ player really sort of opened things up. And I think that was Keith's jam. Really was that kind of extraterrestrial tinkling going around. I love that stuff. And that's when you get your, like in Europe '72. Every other night it's either a Dark Star or another one, about 35-minute visit to the cosmos. I mean, I love that stuff. So. It's partially personal taste, but also I was really intent as a storyteller, and that's kind of what I do with my day job, is to make sure that there was this arc. There was rising action, there was climax, there's conflicts along the way, and hopefully the end of the book talks to the beginning of the book. That's always important, too. I think when you get to that final show in Chicago that Jerry played at Soldier Field, I think that you have to turn back and think about 19. But for me, it was, they're playing in a football stadium, 65,000 people, you got the big speakers. And I'm thinking of one of their first shows. I mentioned their friend Sue Swanson, when they played the first time, she had to remind them all to stand up when they played, because this wasn't folk music. And I'm thinking 30 years later, you're playing in a football stadium, and then your friend says, "Stand up, guys, stand up." That's part of the story too, Yeah.
So specifically that first show that you cover in the book, it's not the first Grateful Dead show, because that was December 4, 1965 at the Fillmore in San Fran, I think, right? So, the very first show in the book is the P&E Garden Auditorium in Vancouver, July 29, 1966. What stood out to you about this specific gig?
Because it was so, I could have picked a lot of shows. Now, that one also was good quality, too. A lot of my education came from listening to Dave's picks, Dick's picks, road trips, all of that wonderful stuff. So those guys educated me a lot, too, that way. But what I liked about that show to start with, other than ironically it was in Canada, it was their first show outside California. But really what it was an archetypal early Dead show where Pigpen's the main guy. He's the guy, he sounds the same in 66 as he does in 72, which is a compliment, but also kind of, it's almost like Pig was there to keep them viable until everybody learned how to find out who they were. Like I say, Garcia's not playing guitar that long. That was what's fascinating for me was to go back and hear Garcia's guitar. You can hear like he's a kind of an amalgam of his influences in 66, and then around 69, he sounds like no one else. He sounds like him, which is the ultimate, that's really to me what I look for in an artist, writer, musician. You can say you don't like it, but you can't say it sounds like anything else. And so so that show to me was just sort of like they're the heavy duty R&B, the blues stuff. Pig's the one out front. You can hear the weirdness coming in a little bit, but still they're trying to get people to dance, which I think we forget. This was a dance band initially, and I think that's one of the things that's cool about the Dead too. I've got a great kind of Grateful Dead tribute band who's playing the Toronto launch of this book December 9th. And what's so cool is everybody dances. It's not everyone stands around and looks cool. Everyone's afraid. Everyone knows you don't look cool, right? Because you can't dance to the Dead like normally. You just sort of sway around.
Well, that first show though that you have in the book, there's like 3 people there, and then you just hear like, and Phil Lesh makes the joke.
Our reputation precedes us, yeah. And I wanted that too. I wanted that too because you think at this point, you won't because you know your stuff and you're a scholar, your field and everything, but I would just say, oh, they're all just classic rock bands. No, these are very different. This was a whole different trajectory. The Dead don't really become sort of part of the mainstream until like 77 or so. And there's some great music in 77, 78, but that show to me was great too. This is their first show out of the United States. And yeah, they're not playing for a bunch of Deadheads. They're playing people saying, hey, play some music. We want to, they probably heard of them. They probably heard of the Acid Test. The hipper people probably did. But for the most part, this is just a cold, here's our band, here we are.
And then when you get to 67 and 68, couple shows there, Winterland in San Francisco, October 22, 1967. February 14, 1968, Carousel Ballroom, San Francisco. So where do you see the band during those 2 years as far as their evolution and what stood out to you about the shows? Because we have lyricist Robert Hunter now part of the mix. You mentioned that. And a great version of Morning Dew in the 68 show.
Yeah, well, see, there's a good example. I'd rather use examples and speak theoretically. Like Morning Dew is just, everybody, that's one of the songs, right? So you get in your sweet spots. You never really go back. So when I went back and was, putting the book together, listening to 67, early 68, you can hear these songs and hear them change. So initially, Morning Dew was like an angry protest song. Like, oh, you people are going to destroy the planet with nuclear war. Oh, you bad generation above us. By 71, 72, it's a dirge. It's an elegy for human nature. It is truly, when W.B. Yeats says, we make it out of arguments with others, we make rhetoric. Of arguments with ourselves, we make art. I mean, by 72, it's art. And it changed. And it changed because they played it over and over again. And it didn't satisfy Garcia. He had to sort of change it. He learned how to sing while he played. We can hear him kind of declaiming the words, and then he just sings in that wonderful, tender voice that he has. And it's just wonderful. But going back, yeah, Hunter is a huge part of it. These guys, and and that's the other thing that'll probably piss some Deadheads off is that, I'm a little bit critical. Like those early songs, they're crappy songs. They're not. I don't hold everything the Grateful Dead ever did as perfect. I think that they're the most fantastic musical experience of my life. But just like life, they're full of sometimes where they're boring, sometimes insipid, sometimes they screw up. But that's what makes them real to me, as opposed to, oh, yeah, I went to that Eagles concert. It sounded exactly like the albums. That was amazing, which is fine. But for these guys, so 67, 68, you were saying, also the songs are starting to stretch out. The drugs are a part of it to a degree, but they're also listening to a lot of jazz. Lesh brings jazz in the band. Kurtzman brings jazz in the band. Garcia was always hip to it. And instead of being like copying licks, I love what Garcia said about Coltrane. He said, well, I've never listened to a song and copy licks, but what I heard was he was speaking in paragraphs with his horn. And that's exactly how I, as a guy who came to the guitar late, I was always like, oh, the guitar solo, get it over with, I heard Garcia speaking. I heard his restless sort of like, oh, I'm here. And then that's when I said, I got to hear everything. And I think that's what's going on in 67. There's so many different things. And then they add Mickey Hart, who changes things. It becomes, there's more bedlam now, more weirdness, the better. And then Garcia is just changing as a guitar player. It seems like every 6 months.
His tone too. He's working on his tone a lot then. Yeah. Yeah. There's different eras of Jerry tone wise that people
and you can get into that with the different guitars. Yeah. But demonstrably, by 69, it's impossible not to know that's him playing guitar, which is a huge accomplishment. To sound like yourself, whether it be in life and books, music, is really hard to do. The world really doesn't want you to do that. The world wants you to sound like everybody else, and and that's part of the appeal of 67, 68 is hearing that those changes. And Lesh too. Lesh early on is kind of a, well, okay, I'm playing the bass. Then eventually, you just hear him get a little restless, and he's like, "Oh, creep away here." It's fascinating stuff.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. The chapter on that first 1969 show that you covered, that's February 11th, 1969, at New York's Fillmore East. Jerry called a meeting to address his concerns about Bob Weir and Ron Pigpen McKernan's performance. Yeah. What were his concerns, and talk about how that meeting ended, or did it even end? I don't know. They don't know how it ended.
It's like a Seinfeld episode where George doesn't know if he's fired. Yeah.
Yes.
And to me, again, like this is the beauty of writing a book. You know, we can have a great conversation, but then you think after, oh, I wished I'd said that. Or one of the things that I learned was there is a Grateful Dead ethos. So Garcia and Lesh feel like Pigpen, you know, he's content to drink and play the blues and not practice the organ. And Weir was willing to practice, but he played the jug in the jug band. He didn't play
jug band. Yeah, they were an out and out jug band, as Bob Weir went.
Like Garcia, we gotta have a good looking guy in the band, so we need Weir. So Weir's the band. And then Weir plays guitar, but he plays pretty much like a folk player, a lot of stuff. And so what happens is, it's in the book, but Garcia and Lesh say to the manager, to Scout and Rock, you know, we got to get these guys out of the band. They're like, you can't. It's like, how can you kick Pig? And what eventually happens is nobody really knows what happens. They kind of, you know, give him the business, and Pig doesn't deny anything. Pig, all you do is drink wine and watch TV. Yep, that's me. And Weir's like, oh, what do you mean I'm not playing? And so Weir goes off for a month. Pig goes off for a month. They take some lessons. They, you know, Garcia and Lesh go off with Mickey Hart and David Crosby and do some like jammy stuff in town. And then a month later, everybody's back on stage. And to me, I love that. It's kind of like a metaphor for society in the sense that, look, everybody's got to pay. Everybody's got to earn their way. But, you know, nobody gets kicked to the curb. It's Pigpen. It's Bob. So, yeah, you can't really – it's like your family. You can get a fight with your wife. You can walk around the block, but you're coming home, right? It's not like when you're dating. It's like, that's my house. I got to come back. You work it out somehow. And they did. Weir became, to me – I don't really know anyone else who plays. Like, he compares himself to McCoy Tyner's piano, to Garcia's Coltrane. But for me, it's even more, not better, but like in the middle, like when you listen to normal rhythm guitar players and you listen to Weir, it's like listening to two different instruments. As with Lesh, like I love Jerry's solo stuff. John Cahn is like an in the pocket guy. He comes from that blues background, R&B background. But then you go back to the Dead and you listen to Lesh. You say, this isn't the same kind of music. There's no one here. It floats. And I love that too. It's on our own terms. Like, this is who we are. We're not a failed Stones. We're something entirely different, right? So take it or not take it. But
we were talking before we started recording. You were asking me, how does a huge Van Halen fan be a Grateful Dead fan? Which is funny. But I remember Sammy Hagar. There's the documentary, which maybe you saw. It was one from a year or two ago.
With Weir, the other one.
Yeah, Sammy was talking about the unusual phrasing in which Bob Weir plays, like the chord structures and all that. He's like, I've never heard anything like it before.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because if you listen to a lot of shows and you put 50 shows together, for the most part, you're hearing a Weir or a Garcia song and a Weir song, so you really can't help but compare them in many ways. And what's interesting, you know, Garcia, for all his genius, he was sort of a classicist, you know, coming from the folk tradition, whereas Weir has these weird time signatures, weird, no pun intended, but I call even his rock stuff like One Large Saturday Night. It's like Chuck Berry with a limp, not quite. But that's what makes it interesting. You know,
yeah, like Saint of Circumstance is one that's got that unusual, like, where are we going with this?
What Estimated Profit?
Estimated Profit.
People say, it's pseudo reggae. I say, I don't think so, because you can't really dance to it. It's like not on the beat. It's like, and then another beat. So I think that's really interesting when you listen to a Dead show. Again, keeping it from being samey. I mean, I love Garcia's solo stuff, and I might write a book about his solo stuff. But there is something about, okay, well, Garcia took us to this very spacey place, and now, you know, we're 25 minutes into this, and then Weir says, no, now we're going to play Big River. And sometimes the fascinating part is you can hear in your headphones, Garcia doesn't want to come down. He doesn't want to come down from the sky. He wants to stay there. And Weir will keep trying to get him to come back. There's some great footage from the August 27th show in Oregon, where they're in a really deep, great dark star. The DVD is called Sunshine Daydream, and you can see Weir just stop at one point, shake his hand, just look around. The sun's going down. It's an outdoor gig, and then just kind of sigh and then go back in. Like it's like,
Yeah,
like
man, that's
you
cool.
didn't have, so I'll go back, and then eventually he plays El Paso, which is just like a bugbear of mine. I don't get it, but
Yeah,
on
I'm
this,
not a fan of that song. You're not a
I
fan
almost
either?
want, I almost wonder if he plays it because he knows it pisses a certain amount of, which is a great reason to do it anyway. But on this night, he plays El Paso, and it feels like we needed to come back down to earth. Thank you, Bob. And Garcia at one point is playing the notes to El Paso, and he's still in the space. Now he's
Yeah.
still in his mind. You can tell. Whenever Lesh takes his glasses off, he's on acid. But but it's this wonderful. Again, not a moment that you can say, "Oh, check this out." Now they're going to switch from this to this. You don't know. For a long time, to keep it fun, which was Garcia's number one dictum, capital F fun. You didn't plan things out. It's the same thing people say, did you plan out this book? I'm like, oh God, that sounds like work. I want to discover something. And I think even with a book like this, which is just, the Grateful Dead 50 shows, I learned a lot about I think like America, North America, and big, what big means, which wasn't something I thought would be one of the things the book will be about. I was talking to my wife about this recently because she's a painter. We're both in our 50s now. How do you keep this being fun? Like, how do you keep doing it? How do you keep doing it the way you did it before you were a professional? Because professionalism is great. It means you get to, talk to you and have a book. It's great. On the other hand, it's not why we started. We started because I was trying to make sense of how this music has bewitched me and captivated me, and how Jerry Garcia, that's where you're starting with when you have good art. It's like, you want to go further. You want to find things out. You want to get to that other place that you don't get on day-to-day level. And I don't think you can get there with a plan.
Let's talk about the show May 26, 1972, because there are a lot of lasts in this particular show. Most notably, Ron McKernan, who dies on March 8th, 1973 from liver damage. He was only 27.
Yeah.
So this is one of his last shows. What stood out to you about his performance on that particular night?
Yeah, well, I think my reaction was similar to yours. I mean, that really was his last show. He played some organ when they came back to the States in the end of May. They had a gig in LA, and he played some organ.
Okay, so this was his last full show then?
Yeah, this is where he sang. He didn't even sing in June. He played, I forget exactly where. It's somewhere in California. It's somewhere in the Los Angeles area. He played some organ on the first version of Stella Blue, actually. But the other show, yeah, by the end of the European tour, he's got a little less piss and vinegar. But for me, what it is that organ that because that was the first tour. Well, Keith joins the band in October of '71, but eventually it doesn't take too long before Pig now can just add color on the Hammond. He doesn't have to be the guy anymore, and it's great. He has a little percussion, has the organ, and Keith handles all of the the piano. But that show particularly, Pig doesn't really have the same energy, but every time I listen to that show, I just hear his organ, that real kind of churchy Hammond organ. They obviously didn't know it was the last gig, so it's not maudlin or sentimental, but you can't help but the thing is, he still played really well on that tour. He sang a lot. He debuted a couple of songs just before they left town. The Stranger, Two Souls in Communion, which is a whole different way of his kind of blues thing. He wrote a song. It's the first song he doesn't try to sound like a blues singer. He sounds like him, and I think it's a huge breakthrough. But something is lost, when they come back and they start touring again at the fall of '72, or summer '72, fall '72. Amazing show. I mean, it's just great. But you kind of know there is something missing. Pig was the one to sing about getting drunk, getting laid, your old lady being mad at you, stuff. And the Dead, for whatever they are great at, that's not their thing. Weir later on did some blues stuff, but to me they always were louder than they were moving. Pig had that funkiness that I think that was a real big deal. So by '72, yeah, and you've got these 3.5, 4-hour shows. You've got country music, you've got blues music, you've got space music, you've got ballads, you've got songs that are unclassifiable, that are just Grateful Dead songs. Over 3.5, 4 hours, it's really like a smorgasbord of like whatever you like, it's there. So, for example, someone like me who didn't really get the space jazzy stuff at first, I love first sets because they had all those great songs, those songs that Hunter and Garcia and Weir wrote in the beginning of the '70s that are just part of the Grateful Dead canon. But then there's all these other things.
As we get to like 72 through 75, is what's starting to change? Is this when the songs start to extend even more, and we're getting some more of the spacey jams?
And not even, and what's interesting too, even when they came back in 77 anyways, they would still play for an hour straight, but instead of doing a 45-minute dark stare, it would be a 10-minute song into 11-minute song. And I really find that when Keith was still strong for the first half of 77, at the very least, that's really where they start to change again, where it becomes almost like a tapestry. I mean, they did that from the beginning. I mean, Live Dead has those connected songs. They learned that from jazz players. But really, by that point, it becomes effortless. They could just whip off. Sometimes you'll have a show and you'll think this is probably the end of the show, and then they'll play for another 40 minutes just because they felt like it. That's interesting too, because they're old enough to like know this is the shit, but also they're young enough that we're human beings, we're physical beings. They could still do that. They could still wake up after 4 hours sleep, and as opposed to saying, where's my masseuse and where's my private chef, and what you need when you're 50 on the road. But these are young people who are they're just so excited, and there's so many new songs too, like 71, 72. Who doesn't want to do that? Whenever time somebody asks me, what's your favorite book that I've written? It's always the new one, right? So they're sharing all these songs, and it's quite overwhelming, really. I mean, it's infinitely re-listenable. I don't know how you could get tired of 71 through 74. And I love Blues for Ella.
Yeah, what about that? What is it about that album that stands out to you?
Well, number one, it starts off with 3 connected tunes. It's a triptych to begin with, which is Very Dead, right? They go from Helping in the Way into Slipknot into Franklin's Tower. To me, it's got that kind of flow of a Grateful Dead. Also, it's got that jazzy timbre. Garcia's playing a lot of really intricate guitar, and the songs are not out of the Americana thing. He said somewhere that they wanted to do something different. That was the only album where they didn't have any songs before they went in the studio. I mean, obviously people had stuff in their mind, like I've been fooling around with this, but it wasn't like, here's my song. So there's a lot of experimentation that goes into that album, and not all of it works, but I adore it because it's, again, a way to, Garcia by that point is 33 years old. It's like, how can we be adults? How can we have kids and mortgages, but still not be the Doobie Brothers? God bless the Doobie Brothers. I'm just saying, how can we still have fun? How can we go home from work tonight and we go home? How was it? Oh, I don't know. Things. I don't know. Yeah, it's alive. It's alive.
Well, Jerry was having fun because you noted he would play anywhere, anytime. Like he couldn't stop. Like
this is the point. Yeah, there's one point, and I just did the math. I'm certainly no Grateful Dead scholar. There's people who are those people, but I find it fascinating to look at. I think I was talking about a series of 3 Dead shows. And then I was looking in the Dead base and realizing on the weekend he played twice with Merle Saunders playing jazz funk at the Keystone, and then they had another Dead show, and at the end of the week he played with his bluegrass band, Old and in the Way, and if he was any kind of junkie, it was a music junkie, that constant interaction with the audience. And again, in those places he loved them because the Dead are by that point getting to be more hockey rink. And he's still playing, like some of those great Garcia shows that have been released from the Garcia family. There's 120 people. It's a place where you have your chicken fried steak and you 2 drink minimum, and it's a funky little place, and you love it.
I'm sure you loved it.
And to me, again, talking about the podcast or writing books, he's doing it because he wants to do it. The experience is the payoff. Sure, it's nice to get paid to do your job. And sure, it's nice to have somebody read your book. But really, it's about, did you have fun when you did it? Was it important to you? Did it make your life make more sense? Which I really think a lot of art is. It's an attempt to make the Grateful Dead make sense to me, but also it's a way for me to make sense of my days, which are just kind of these empty slates that if you're lucky enough not to have to get up at 8 o'clock and go to something, like, what do you fill your days with? Well, you fill it with purpose, and I think that's what Garcia did for a long time.
71 to 74 is your era. For me, it's late 70s. So now we get into the era, which I love.
Yeah, I mean, I did the liner notes for Dave's Picks 45, which was 2 shows from 77. And Dave knew that my period is 71, 74, but he knew how much I love 77 as well. And again, writing those gave me a chance to go, why do I love 77? It's not the psychedelic thing as much. It's a little harder brand, And I thought, well, that's what I like. And all of the great songs, Terrapin Station,
yes.
Prophet,
Yes.
Fire on the Mountain. I don't want to lose those songs. And I think maybe early on I was like, I'm into 72. Well, no, and it's kind of like life. You can't say, well, I'd like to have just this, because then you're going to miss this, and you get this. And I like some of that intensity from 77, 78. Jerry's doing some fanning in 77 or 78. He's doing some power chords, but partially it's the coke, also partially it's it's being 33 and it being Iowa, and like, why am I here in February in Iowa? God bless Iowa, but just there's some anger in their playing. It's refreshing. It's interesting.
Yes, but it's also the era when we hear Jerry with the wah wah
Oh, the Mutron. Oh, yeah, right. And that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting.
Love that.
On,
Never
on,
grow tired of that.
no, on Fire, and I get tired of a lot of the, when we get to the 80s and 90s, the MIDI stuff is not my cup of tea. I think one of the things that make the Dead so great is all the space, and not spaciness, but the space in their music, like a jazz band. There's lots of white space around. Miles Davis is famous for that. I think it was Keith Jarrett maybe said to him at some point during the Bitches Brew time, like, well, sometimes I don't know what to play. There's so much going on. So Miles typically said, "But don't play anything, then, motherfucker. Like, don't play something then. You don't have to play something." Wow. But if you're playing a stadium or you're playing a football stadium, every sound is cranked with it. But the Mutron to me is connected enough to the guitar but it's got this unique, fresh weirdness to it. That's Estimated Prophet, Fire in the Mountain, and yeah, some of those transitions. Well, that's how you knew it. That's when I knew I was getting into the Dead. When I would say, well, I love this Scarlet Fire, but what I really love is the transition.
Scarlet Begonias into Fire in the Mountain.
No, you got to check. In fact, Iowa has a great transition. So there you go. And that's one of the shows in here. It's like this show kind of sucked, kind of boring in places. And then, whoa, hang on. We're going a different place. And that's why I say a great Dead concert is like life. I mean, not every day is great. Not every day's probably got a little bit of everything to it, right? And if you hang in there till the end, you might find a great Scarlet Fire,
Scarlet Begonias and War Frat are probably my two favorite from that era. Now, those are both written around that time, I think, late 70s.
No,
or mid 70s.
War Frat is actually on Skull and Roses 71.
Right, okay.
And Scarlet Begonias is off of U.S. Blues, so 74. Those songs are interesting to me. Those are your favorites because when writing this book, you're trying to say, well, what kind of music is this? Like War Frat to me is unclassifiable. Like you call that country, rock, blue. I don't know what it is other than it's a great Jerry Garcia Hunter song. Stella Blue as well. Stella Blue could sound like the 1920s. It's a ballad that kind of floats. Lesh's notes just do. It's and I think that again is why to me the most you can give to anyone is your time, and I give a lot of time to the Dead, and it's for songs like that where I really don't. I can see why people don't get it right away. Because they don't sound like any other songs,
There was a while there I couldn't differentiate. I didn't know some of those songs that were in the sets were Jerry solo songs. I mean, they're all
they're very polymorphous. This band, they would switch songs back and forth. Apparently, I'm not an insider, but apparently there was some resentment, perhaps among the Dead, with a lot of Jerry's outside the Dead dalliances, because of course he's their guy. But I think they also knew that he needed to do that to be himself, to stay interested. That's the other thing. I mean, they're very different shows. Like Garcia's show isn't a miniature Grateful Dead show. It's very different. It's mostly covers. He gets to do all the singing. He plays a lot of guitar. There's a bottom to it. Ron Tutt, the great drummer who played with everybody. Graham Parsons are out there with Elvis. John Conn, who's right in the pocket. Very different experience, And I say this as a positive, but an incredibly restless mind. V.S. Pritchett said about the Russian writer Chekhov, he said, genius is spiritual greed. I always like that. I need more of this.
Well, and I think that was the addictive behavior. Maybe that was also the difficulties that he had with the drugs.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know the guy, and I'm not a psychologist, but I think there was a disappointment where you end up in, say, 1980 that, okay, we're a big rock band, and do we have to? It just seemed to me that it became kind of boring. And there are some great shows and some great moments, even in shows that aren't great. I got a show from 81 that's kind of so-so, and then there's this moment where it happens. But I do feel that we are human beings. We're not just Spotify. These are actual physical human beings. And I think in the early mid-70s, they're younger, they're stronger. You can't be curious if you're not physically well. There's not enough drugs to make you feel good all the time. They'll make you feel bad. And I think that's that sweet spot that we have. And I find it incredibly, I don't know if encouraging is the right word, or sustaining somehow, when they come back from the retirement in 76 and they try to exist within the system. We're not going to tour big places. We're going to sell our tickets to our fans, and we have our own record label. And none of this stuff really works. But they tried. They didn't say, how can we ingratiate ourselves further? It was like, how can we maintain our integrity, but yet still make this a career? This is clearly a career now. We all miss this. But how do we still have fun? Instead of playing for 13,000 people one night, we'll play 6 nights for 2,200 people. Not a good decision financially.
What a segue, because I was going to ask you about that.
Okay, good.
Yes. Ray Robertson, the author of All the Years Combined, The Grateful Dead in 50 Shows. But yeah, that is interesting to me. There's a comment you lead with on the chapter covering a show on July 17, 1976 at the Orpheum Theater in San Francisco. So this is what you write here. There's a price to be paid for doing what you want to do, just as there is for doing the right thing. And it doesn't take an accountant specializing in the music business to determine that it makes more economic sense to perform once before an audience of 13,200 people than it does to play the same city 6 separate times, each before audiences of 2,200. And the cost isn't only monetary or logistical. No matter how young or zealous you are, it would take an extraordinary amount of energy and commitment to simply attend 6 Grateful Dead shows in 7 nights when you're talking about performing those same shows and performing them like the Grateful Dead did, without a song list, without a roadmap, without a net. The price, physical, psychological, and creative, is incalculable. But that's what the Dead did, July 12 through 18, 1976, because one of their credos when they returned to touring was less is more. It might not have been a prudent move financially or physically, but it certainly paid off artistically. So what led to this decision? Like what, because this is interesting. Is this when it all starts, these marathon back-to-back gigs?
Well, first of all, I address a previous question. You asked me how I selected certain shows. I wanted, for example, to have those 3 shows in a row. I couldn't do 6, but to show how they literally did play the same place. And look at the set list. They're not similar. But the thing that you're asking about, I think, is really at the core of the book, as we talked about at the end of the book, success. Well, they weren't, not too many. When they shut down in 74 for 18 months, they weren't in decline. It was because they were too, Garcia especially, it's too big. It's not fun anymore. It's not good anymore. So we're going to come back. 18 months. Everybody does their solo albums. They have their record label. When they come back in 76, we are going to do it on a different scale. We're going to try to sell tickets directly to our fans. I mean, that was something radical at the time, right? Like, you write in and we'll sell you tickets. It worked out, but not as well as it would. Have our own record label. In fact, have our own record label for solo projects that we know aren't going to make any money. They're weird, but we'll subsidize that. And this wasn't like having your own label within a label. This was their own money kind of deal, right? Which they lost a lot of. And the shows too, and that's what's really beautiful about that little run, those 6 shows in San Francisco, was before the break, they were playing hockey rinks. And they still played a few. But yeah, 6 shows in 6 nights. The idea was we want to hear each other. We want to see the audience. We want to have fun. We want to make this a career, but still a vocation. But then by 77, 78, you see the drift. And they're not playing 2300 anymore, because it's kind of like saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts. It's hard to exist within the system and not become part of it, And I love the fact that they tried to, they tried to say.
Were they the first band to do this?
Yeah. I mean, like, to have their own label, sell their own tickets, and play smaller places, and not as old rich people, but as old rich rock stars. It's like, these are guys in their 30s. Weir was probably in his probably his late 20s. Of course, he was born in 42, so he's 34 in 76. So by 34, yeah, you've accumulated some life. You've got some kids. You've got probably some alimony. You probably got a couple ex-wives kind of deal. Some people have drug habits that you paid for, etc. But let's put that over here, and let's remember number one. Number one is the music, and not in a press release, but as a real. How can I prove it to you? Because we're playing 6 nights here and not 1 night across town at the hockey rink, right? It's so much is just words. But these guys really put their money where their mouths was. That's when when there's actually something financial is at stake, and it doesn't take too long. And that's part of the narrative arc. I feel great optimism. And then in 78, it starts to change. And yeah, you are playing the bigger places. Until the 90s, you are playing football stadiums, which is a whole different dynamic.
You include what many fans say is the holy grail of Dead shows, May 8th, 1977 in Ithaca, New York. And I remember Rolling Stone's David Brown, he wrote an article titled The Grateful Dead's Greatest Year. You say that even if there were a Greatest Dead show, which there isn't, this show wouldn't be it. Can you explain first why fans say it's the best, and then why you disagree?
Well, it's a great show. And I also think, and this goes back to the older generation, the ones way before me, the traders, the great Betty Cantor Jackson tapes, they were circulating. And so they sounded really good. And so even if you're getting a cassette, the quality of the tape was so good. It just sounded so good. And there are shows that are amazing shows from 73 that sound like what they are. They sound really, really rough. So of course, but also it has that it has that great Morning Dew. And it has, does it have a Scarlet Fire as well? I forget, but it's just an amazing show.
I think it's on there.
But the first set to me isn't a great first set. It's a good first set. I love it. But I think and also I think people like to be able to say, this is my favorite. This is my, I don't know. It's kind of our mindset, you have to be
Right.
left wing or right wing, or you can't like say, let me think about the issue. You got to have a position, which I think is part of the reason our world is so insane. This sort of obsession with this binary understanding of reality. If you listen to the Dead enough or taking up drugs, you realize this is all made up stuff anyway. We're just making this stuff. This week it's called this, and next week it's called that, and last week it was. So I think there's something about the Dead that's true of that. So I think there's a bit of that, but I certainly agree. I was actually tempted not to put the show in there. I'd probably get more attention if I didn't, but I couldn't help it because it really is an amazing show. And when those morning dews are brought out in '77, when they have all that power we talked about, there is that power from '77 with the subtlety, with the delicacy. It's a combination that's just overpowering, and I really think that is one of my favorites. Although the morning dew from '72, and there's one from '78, in October of '78. So that's part of the fun of being a Deadhead too. Is you can kind of this version and this version.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. The last show of the 70s in the book is New Year's Eve, 1978, Winterland Arena, San Francisco. And you leave with, quote, the end of the year, the end of an era, the end of the line. The show goes all the way into the morning hours and morning dew, by the way. They play that at 4 a.m. or around 4 a.m. Bill Graham offers breakfast for 5,000 people and everyone went home with the sun in the sky. It's amazing. Was this the end of the Grateful Dead at its peak from a consistent night in, night out aspect?
A lot of people would disagree, but I think so. And that's, again, the novelist eye. I love the fact that they're shutting the Winterland down. Like, so, you want something physically commensurate with it. So it's like, not only I think the God Shoes are kicked out of the band 2 months later. Keith's not bringing much. I think that's been said enough for various reasons. There's sometimes when you're listening, you don't even know there's a keyboard player in the band. I do feel that is not that show's perfect, but I really think that's the end of a certain era of the Grateful Dead. I think that's the end of part 2. I think part 1's the takeoff. 2 is, 70, 71 up to 78. And then after that, there's the next part of the journey, which is, I think for some people conflated with the fact that, I saw a bunch of shows in 87, I met my wife there. Well, that's great. But with the headphones on, after everybody's gone, what have we got? And I think it's a more interesting kind of music before. But that doesn't mean there's not valuable stuff. There's lots of good stuff. But to me, that really is the end. I think Garcia is less interested in the Grateful Dead after that. He gets better, he gets healthy. There's the spring of '90 is highly heralded. But I just think that it's not everything to him anymore. And I think for better or for worse, we need our artists, our athletes, whatever, to be totally obsessive. To think there's nothing more important. Although that's not true, we need them to believe that for us to kind of find that thing. And I don't know if it's the most important thing in the world. I don't think Garcia was happy with the way that the world was in 1980, in terms of what the counterculture turned into, what America turned into, what the music industry was. The music industry was increasingly, what it was supposed to be from the beginning, and when the mainstream took it over, it was supposed to be entertainment to sell lots of units, right? And so, and I don't want to psychoanalyze, but that's one of the reasons probably that he cocooned with drugs. And
I hope he didn't regret Shakedown Street because I love it. I know it's a radio single. It's kind of disco-ish, but
but the live versions, the live version. Don't. Yeah, I mean, I even like the dance in the street. I just don't like the dancing.
Right.
They could have done a better job in the book, but the jamming's good. That's the thing about the Dead too. Sometimes I'll have friends.
Oh, the extended jam on that.
Yeah, on Shakedown Street. And I'll say to people who are like friends of mine who I get into the Dead, usually I get them into the space stuff, and they'll say, "What is that?" I say, "Just listen to Jerry's guitar. Forget, this or that or whatever." There's usually something, even on the most, mundane, tune. You go, "Wow, that's interesting. That little thing." And I just find there's less of that as time goes on. If we're into a certain point, I think it's more concerned. We come back to that word professionalism. But there's no real dud shows for the Dead for the most part after that point. I mean, there's some when Garcia's sick, with drugs and things. But I mean, when he gets healthy, in the late 80s, I mean, every show is consistently professional. But to me, I don't want professional. I want, okay, this is kind of, whoa, I forgot my name, I want that. It's not fair to ask people to do that for their entire lives. I mean, I saw Dylan once at a really small place near Niagara Falls, and musically, it was karaoke. It's Bob Dylan karaoke. He's at a keyboard. But he deserves that right. He deserves the right to fly around the world and do Bob Dylan karaoke, all right? But I would rather go to some club and see some young people play who are this is important that you need to know this, in
Right.
terms of like that kind of vibe, right? And I think that there's definitely periods of resurgence in the Dead in the 80s and 90s, and I note some of the high notes. But for me, I think that kind of like the music is the most important thing. There's not people, not relationships. This is why artists make bad, parents and lovers and things, because it's like this is the most important thing. But we get these artifacts that'll never go away. As long as we're on planet Earth, you can always listen to that February night in Iowa in '78 and go, wow. We don't need the people anymore. We don't need Billie Holiday anymore. We have our music.
Thank God for that. Yeah. So you have a show in 81, which was May 6th of 81, Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, Uniondale, New York. And then there's that 5-year gap. Skip ahead to December 15 of 1986, Oakland, Alameda County Coliseum. Yeah. And the first song in that 86 show, Touch of Grey, hadn't been recorded yet, which is interesting.
But been playing it for almost 5 years.
They had been playing it for a while.
And Jerry came back. And also, it was my way. I always find a way of screwing up a book and making it unsellable. So this is probably what I did in the sense that show is really cherished by Deadheads because it's a very emotional thing. He'd been
Candyman, right? Yeah, he's singing Candyman, and he says the Candyman is back in town.
Yeah, and the crowd's going, that's beautiful. But I think sometimes we tend to confuse the personal with the aesthetic. And I don't think it's a great show. I think it's an amazing experience for Jerry Garcia and for fans. But that's kind of my job, is to say, well, hold on a minute here. Does it hold up to this other kind of stuff? Well, no, but that's okay. I try not to be, I'm not dismissive. I think it's an amazing experience. Just like hearing Jerry sing, Black Muddy River when he could barely get the words out, but it's not an aesthetic experience. It's more like I'm watching a man say goodbye.
Well, that's what I think of when I think of that last show, 1995. For me, when he's singing So Many Roads, gives me the chills. That gives me the chills.
Yeah, but if he was singing, I don't know, They Love Each Other that way, you wouldn't have. You'd say, God, you can't sing anymore or whatever kind of deal. No, it's not that. It's because of the circumstances. And that song is so very much, there's not a lot of great Hunter Garcia songs for me in the last 15 years, but that's one that's maybe not musically, it's particularly innovative, but it's extremely moving and it's very powerful.
Supposed to be on their that was supposed to be on their anniversary album. It was going to be like a 40. How many years would it have been at that point? 1990. It would have been a 30-year anniversary album they were going to make. Yeah. And this was one of the songs to be recorded.
And the Dead, or Dave Lemieux, did put together, Ready or Not, sort of a kind of an approximation of what that record would be, or CD, what do you want to call it. And there are some good songs, but I think they're more impactful because of the circumstances of Garcia's life. So that's kind of the job, is to sort of say, this is this. It's just like when I wrote the first draft of this, and I had my editor looked at the chapter from 1990 when I talk about sort of how it explodes. And
March 29, 1990, Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum. I want to get that in there. I don't want to leave
I'll just preface it by saying that, I think he was right. I think initially I didn't have enough respect or understanding how people had an amazing experience, but it wasn't necessarily a musical experience. And just ironically, this is a very dead kind of fashion. As I was rewriting that draft, a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in a couple of years, 2 or 3 years because of COVID, the writer Jason Snyder, a music writer, he came by. I hadn't seen him in a long time. He said, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I told him. He said, "Oh, wow, I saw the Dead 13 times in the 80s. Really? In the 90s? Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah, in high school, they just were like the opposite of all the..." And it gave him that sense of community. And then you go and you see Shakedown Street, and he said it was amazing. And I think that's in the book now. And I have to acknowledge that. But it's a non-musical thing. It was more of a... He loved the fact, too. He said, boy, I was always a bad dancer, and everybody was dancing, so I felt it was okay to dance. You go to a Neil Young show, you can't dance, It's like you're saying you look cool. And so I thought that was really delightful and wonderful. And I think that's part of it. But, again, we're all gone. There's just the music left. What do you hear in the headphones? And to me, I don't hear as much in 86 as I do in 76. And I try to give reasons for that. Not everyone's going to agree, and that's fine. We're allowed to have opinions, right? For now, anyway.
Well, I guess so. Last question. Is there a particular go-to show for you, like personally, if you're feeling down, stressed out, just any particular show that you're going to like, that's the one I got to play?
It's more songs. I know a good Scarlet Fire from 77 or 78 will fill me up, if the world's beating me down a bit. If I'm really wanting to sort of escape from the world, a Stella Blue, a Wharf Rat, or a China Doll will...
Oh, China Doll.
Again, what kind of song is that? It's not... You know, think of that in 1974. Like in 1974, you can see how it's like, oh, I got my Steve Miller, I got my Stones, I got my Who. What the is this? Which still, and that song's like 49 years old, and it still, to me, doesn't sound like any other song, which is why we keep listening to them, right?
And I think if you asked 100 Dead fans what their favorite song is,
Yeah.
probably 100 different answers. Like I remember recently somebody saying High Time. It's like, oh, that's
Right.
a good one. That's a good choice.
Yeah. Well, most people would say Ripple, right? Or Trucking.
Ripple, yeah.
Or, and of course, you know, to me, my go-to, if I'm converting someone and trying to turn someone to Dead, it's always a Dark Star from 72, 73.
Oh,
It's
man.
like, what is this? Or a Dark Star.
How about though the single version of it, that 2 minute? That's so
with the banjo
bizarre.
on it?
Yeah, it's so bizarre, man. What it became and what it started out as. Yeah.
You asked me, the first question you asked me is why I wrote the book. So it's kind of, we're wrapping things up. This is a good way to come back to it. One of the first shows I didn't write them in order necessarily. One of the first shows I wrote was one of the shows in the book. I think it's from Austin or Texas, either Austin or San Antonio. And it's 71. They just added Keith. It's the fall. And it's a first set Dark Star. That's kind of cool. And they're playing, and you're thinking, and again, they're playing a place that's like 1,300 people. So it's pretty intense. And then at some point, Bob leads them into El Paso, or me and my uncle or something. And you can just imagine what these Texans, I lived in Texas for 3 years. You don't have to be into country to have country music be a part of it. So they're listening to this, you know, they're spacing out. And then we're into Marty Robbins or into Johnny Cash, and then come back into Dark Star in the first set, no less. I wanted that show in the book. I didn't know where I was going to fit. But like, this is one of the reasons that I said, well, I'm going to spend the next 2 years of my life in my shed out back, listening to Grateful Dead, because I still get excited. And these are 2 tracks. These are not like amazing, you know, they sound wonderful, but they're not high. They're not high psychedelic, you know, hi-fi. And you're listening to this, and you're thinking, wow, this little group of people gathered, 1,700 people on this Wednesday night in Austin, Texas, and they were all part of this experiment, you know. And that to me is not a rock concert. That is something different. So
much more than just a concert.
Yeah.
All the years combined, the Grateful Dead in 50 shows out November 7th through Biblioasis Books. What a great name. Biblioasis.
I'm not just saying they're Canada's best publisher. They publish a lot of stuff. And the fact that they allow me to write, you know, novels and books on death and then go, I got a book on the Grateful Dead. Okay. I'm really fortunate. They're very, again, antithetical to our culture in the sense of very specific. So Biblioasis is a wonderful publisher. Yeah.
I'm going to lend this to my older brother, Marty, who got me into the Dead. I don't know if I'll ever get it back. I wouldn't. Cool. Yeah. Oh yeah. He got me into him. So Marty, this one's for you. It's coming.
That's beautiful. Man. That's lovely to hear.
Yeah. And where can people find you online, Ray?
I'm not an online guy too much, but I have a guy who does my stuff. So I've got a website. He did a nice job on that. And then the usual Facebook, Instagram. If you want to get a hold of me, though, use the website. I'm more of an email guy, but I've got Facebook and Instagram for events and, you know, that kind of thing.
And what's the website address?
Just rayrobertson.com.
Okay, so I'll put a link in the show notes. So
yeah, that would be cool. Yeah.
Go there.
Get a hold of me through emails there. There's stuff about the new books and stuff like that. There's some, yeah.
Beautiful. All right, Ray, thanks so much, man.
I appreciate it.
That's it. It's in the books.